Today we're going to be overviewing the book of Numbers. And Numbers is in the middle of a greater section called the Pentateuch, which are the first 5 books of the Bible. And these are the books of the law that were given by Moses. And these books serve as a foundation for all that God requires of his people. And so as you begin to read through Numbers, what you're doing is you're picking up right where the book of Leviticus left off. God is giving laws and instructions at Mount Sinai. And the book of Numbers, as its name communicates, is full of just that. There's lists of names and numbers. Moses is tasked with taking a census and numbering specifically all the men who are able-bodied and of age for military service. And this process is done to prepare the nation for traveling through the wilderness and then into conquest in the Promised Land. But one misnomer about Numbers is that that's all that's in this book. The numbering part actually only takes a few of the chapters. There's 36 total chapters, and it's really bookended by these lists of numbers as Moses takes 2 separate census of the people. And so you see that in chapters 1 through 4, there's an original numbering, and then all the way in chapter 26, about 40 years later, you have a second numbering. And in between those 2 numberings, you have chapters that are chock full of stories of wilderness wanderings and military conquests and stories of rebellion, ungratefulness from the people, as well as stories of God's sovereign provision and protection for his people. Along with all of these stories is also lots of instruction and laws as God communicates how his people are to live and worship him once they enter the Promised Land. So the title Numbers doesn't quite fully grasp everything that's in this book, and we get this title from the Greek translation of the Septuagint, but in Hebrew the title literally means in the wilderness. So as you prepare to read this book, you might be tempted to skip over names and numbers. You might be tempted to go really fast to exciting parts. But don't do that, and here's why. We have to ask the question, why have these been recorded for us? Why are these written down in this book? Well, Numbers serves really as an integral part of this greater narrative of what God is doing with his people. Starting all the way back with Abraham in Genesis, and then through Isaac and Jacob, and now through Moses, as Moses leads this newly freed nation of former slaves toward the land of promise. And the narrative not only serves to tell this story, but the narrative along with these lists of names and lists of laws are communicating some things about the human heart, as well as God's holiness and justice, and his love for his people. And this is the main theme of Numbers. If you're going to take one thing away from this video, it's this: God is faithful in the wilderness. There's no rebellion, there's no foreign enemy, no false god or pagan prophecy, no hunger or thirst that is greater than God, and that will thwart his faithfulness to his people. That's what we're going to discover in the book of Numbers. So let's walk our way through Numbers quickly here. Numbers begins in a specific place, and then we find Israel in 3 separate locations. And so in these locations, God is giving them instructions and laws, but between those locations, there's travel that happens. So you'll see 3 main places where God is speaking to Israel. And then in between those, we've got travel stories of them moving from one location to another. So you'll see them at Sinai at the beginning. They move to Kadesh, and then they'll move to the plains of Moab. And that really builds the framework for what happens in the book of Numbers. And let's look at let's just walk our way through each one of these sections really quickly. The first section will be chapters 1 through chapter 10, verse 10. And here we see the people camped at Sinai. So they're right where they were when Leviticus left off. And we find final arrangements for travel. Moses is numbering the people. He's arranging the camp for travel. And God gives final instructions to the people. What we see in this section is that God is very detailed and organized as he structures this camp for travel. The entire layout of the camp is a picture of the importance of God's presence among his people. God is at the center, and all the tribes that surround the tabernacle show the importance of the nation as God's presence dwells in the center of the nation. When we get up to chapter 10, everything seems great. Everything's good. The people are numbered. Everything's organized. They're going to begin their travel from Sinai towards the promised land. And there's a sense of excitement as the people begin to move. But then we get to section 2, and everything changes. Because in section 2, we have our first section of travel stories from Sinai to Kadesh. And one thing that will be helpful for you as you read through this book is to have a map handy, because it's going to help you pinpoint locations as we're told them in the Bible. So keep one of those handy so you can kind of map the travel here from one place to the other. But we get to chapter 10, the people begin to travel, and as you look at the map, what you'll find is the promised land is not that far away from Sinai. They don't have that far to travel. You could do that travel easily in 2 weeks, maybe a couple of months with a group this size. And so they're beginning this travel, and they get 3 days into their journey, and everything changes. The people grumble. The people complain. They're ungrateful with what God has provided for them. And so God responds by sending fire into the camp, and then quail along with plagues, and then the complaining gets worse. And it's not just the people complaining, but Moses' own family members are turning on him and opposing his leadership. And God responds by striking Miriam with leprosy. And when the people finally make it to Kadesh, we find a very important point of this story. They send 12 spies into the promised land to bring back a report. They're ready to go. 2 of the spies come back, and they've got a great report. This is our land. God's going to give it to us. It's great. Let's go. And 10 of them are afraid of what they saw, and they say they're giants. They're gonna kill us. There's no way we're going to get into this land. And what we find happening is the people rebel at the report of the spies, and they seek to overthrow Moses as their leader. So they're not very far into this journey. They've reached Kadesh. And it's not taken very long to see the hearts of the people. Think about it. They've been slaves in Egypt just maybe over a year ago. And now they're forgetting everything that God has provided for them at this point. And they've rejected God, and they're refusing to go into the promised land. It's a big mess, and we see rebellion. God's turning on the people in wrath, and Moses is standing in between, pleading for them. And God does not wipe them out, but he grants them their wish. This entire generation that's rejected God here, because of their rebellion, God's going to withhold the promised land from this entire generation. And so their sentence is 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. 1 year for each day it took for the scouts to scout out the land. And that was section 2. So that took us from chapter 10, verse 10, all the way through chapter 14, which brings us to section number 3. And here we find God giving instruction to the people at Kadesh. And so this is chapters 15, verse 1, all the way through chapter 19. So remember, they're at Sinai, they receive instruction, they travel to Kadesh, and now they're receiving more instruction. And so as they're settled here, God communicates laws about sacrifice and purification and instructions for the Levites and their worship. And all of this is in preparation for when they will be worshiping God in the Promised Land. And what's become very evident in the hearts of the people is their need for sacrifice in order for God to remain in their presence. Atonement has to be made. So God's very clear with instruction for these sacrifices. The rebellion isn't over yet, though, and here in this section we have whole family groups that turn against Moses in rebellion, and the family of Korah turn against him, and God responds to them by literally swallowing them up in the ground. So God is not going to tolerate this kind of rebellion. So you have both of those things happening here at Kadesh. And after this big story of rebellion and it's more mess and God swallows them up, we find another section of travel stories. So they're going to move on from Kadesh, and that brings us to section number 4. Section number 4 is chapters 20 through chapters 22, verse 1. And here we find them traveling from Kadesh all the way to the plains of Moab. In this section, we see the death of some real key leaders from the first generation that came out of Egypt. You see Miriam die and Aaron die. As they travel in this section, we see more opposition, but this time it's not just from within the camp, but there's opposition from nations and kingdoms outside of the camp. And God destroys these nations that stand in their way. Along with these battle stories, though, comes more grumbling and complaining from the people. And in response to this grumbling and complaining, God sends poisonous serpents that bite the people. Along with the serpents, he also provides a way of salvation, though. And so Moses is supposed to raise up this bronze serpent on a staff so everyone can see it. All who look at the serpent will live. What we see happening here is that in the midst of the complaining, in the midst of the destruction and the consequences for their sin, God graciously provides a way of salvation. God remains faithful in the wilderness to his covenant. And that's section 4, which brings us to the final section of the book, which is chapters 22, verse 2, all the way through the end of chapter 36. Here we see God giving instruction in Moab. So they've traveled from Kadesh to Moab, and now God's going to give them instruction. And this section starts off with a really fascinating story about God protecting his people. If you think about where they're at, they're complaining against God. God sent plagues on them, and in the midst of all of this going on, without them even knowing it, the king of Moab is trying to get God to curse his people. And so the king of Moab hires a prophet named Balaam. He's pagan. He's a false prophet for hire. And Balaam tries 4 times to call down a curse from God on his people, and God will not allow him. Every time he speaks, God only allows him to speak blessing on his people. And what we see here is God being faithful in the wilderness, with enemies that are even unknown to the people. And this story, it's crazy. It's full of talking donkeys and angels and oracles from Balaam. And it's really, you won't want to miss that in chapters 22 through 24. The rest of the book, chapters 25 through 36, is a conclusion. We've got a new census for the new generation, more numbers, and this new generation is almost ready to enter the land. They choose a new leader. Joshua is going to take them into the promised land. And there's even more stories of battles and rebellion and final instructions. And this all sets up for Moses' final address to the people before they enter the promised land, because part of God's judgment for what happened in the book of Numbers is Moses is not going to be allowed into the promised land. And so that's the next book, which is Deuteronomy, when Moses addresses the people. So as you read through this section, you're going to find a friend in chapter 33. This chapter highlights the entire journey and with place names, kind of like a travel itinerary. This is everywhere they went, starting in Egypt, all the way to the point when they're ready to enter the promised land. And that's going to help put the whole thing into perspective for you. So, that's the book of Numbers. And what have we discovered? Well, the theme of this book is evident, right? God is faithful in the wilderness, and there's no opposition that will keep God from fulfilling his promise. And along with that theme, we see highlighted the human heart that forgets God's goodness and turns away in ungratefulness. And what's evident in these people is evident in our own hearts, and it reveals our own condition. And then we also see that sin has consequences, and justice will be met because God is a holy God. He's just. And because of the sin of the people and rebelling against God, there's an entire generation that must die before the people are allowed to enter the promised land. So as we conclude this overview of Numbers, I want to leave you with this. We have to understand Numbers is a small piece of a larger story that is being told through the whole book of the Bible. And everything is pointing towards Jesus as part of this greater redemption story. So as we read the book of Numbers, we have to ask, how is this pointing us towards Jesus? How is this preparing us for Jesus coming? And there's three quick ways I want to highlight that we see that here. First, Moses and Aaron act as mediators between God and the people. And so you see them standing before God, interceding for them, making sacrifices for them, and speaking to God and for God in between God and the people. And this really prepares us for what Jesus is going to be for his people as the one mediator between God and man. Second, we see a clear picture of Jesus as Savior with the serpent that's raised up on the staff. Jesus said to Nicodemus in John chapter 3 that as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. And then finally, Balaam gives us a prophecy that points right to Jesus, this pagan prophet for hire, leaves us with this incredible statement about Jesus. He says, there will be a star that will rise out of Jacob to rule over the nations. And that's Jesus. He's going to be the ruler that these people need. Moses has failed. Every other leader is going to fail them. But Jesus will be the rising star that comes to rule the nations. And this is how God's going to keep his promise to bless the nations through Abraham, to bless the whole world. So I hope this prepares you to be ready to read through the book of Numbers as you see that God is faithful in the wilderness.